Well, thank you very much, Chairman, for the brief introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, at this point in my life, I prefer brief introductions because long introductions sound increasingly like an obituary, a reckoning that I'd like to postpone. Thank you also, sir, for providing us with a different kind of designation, and that is alumnus of applied brilliance. I've been called a lot of things in my life, but never an alumni of applied brilliance. This is a designation that I will cherish and naturally will revise my biography accordingly. But let me also thank you seriously for this invitation to be here this morning and for the opportunity afforded to join in a conversation about things that matter with people who can make a difference. The previous speakers today reaffirmed my faith in the power of the mind and the power of creative thinking. And we can only hope that there'll be more occasions like this to provide the mind with an opportunity to flower, as we heard last night and this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, looking over the conference theme, I cannot help but marvel at the timing of our proceedings this week. 2 years ago, the organizers chose a subject with a direct relevance to what's happening to our world at this time. This is nothing short of prophetic. And any reader of the news today cannot help but appreciate the fact that we are indeed at a turning point, at least in the economic sphere, and I'm sure this will carry over into other spheres. Freezes in the credit market, the loss of confidence in financial leaders, and serious risks of instability in the world's financial system. Suddenly, multilateral cooperation is back, governments have been rediscovered, and now it is clear that intervention and regulations are no longer the rants of liberals, but necessities for economic stability. Yes, the world is about to turn a page, but will it be a turn for the better? Will the turn be pain-free, non-regulated, and the human community any better off? Analysts are working to provide answers. And everywhere one looks, they suggest that there is one factor that has to be taken into account, and that is the question of our indebtedness. We seem to be a debtor species, and everywhere one looks, the debt problem surfaces again and again. I had a friend who did a film recently called In Debt We Trust, and he showed the seductivity of the credit card, where young people, teenagers, are being saddled with debt that they may not be able to afford. And the question is, how do we reckon with the problem of our indebtedness? But indebtedness is not simply a matter of the economy. It also translates into what I call another debt, namely the earth debt. Our productivity success has often been achieved at the expense of the Earth's carrying capacity, and we're depleting the Earth capital at an alarming rate, and there is no bailout in sight. There is no ecosystem manager convening emergency meetings to negotiate agreements and fix it. And in many instances, the public remain unaware of this debt. The present situation is eerily reminiscent of another market failure some 20 years ago, the great stock market crash of 1987, which mercifully was very brief and largely local in impact, and the fixers were able to put the system back together in very short order. But even while this was happening, something else was on the horizon, and that was of greater import, at least to the human community and our sustainable future. And that was the viability of the planet on which all life depended and which received little or no attention. On October 7, 1987, UN had chosen this date to release the so-called Brundtland Commission report on environment and development, which had been under preparation for 1,000 days. A special session of the General Assembly was convened for this purpose, and the former Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, was invited to present a report which projected a possible ecosystems crash. The stock market crash is now familiar, but what if there was an ecosystems crash? What, for example, would happen if the Gulf Stream, otherwise known as the heat pump, had jammed, or the currents of the planet reversed themselves? Could we fix it? And so Brundtland came to warn the world about the peril of the global debt, environmental debt, the earth debt, and the possibility of an ecosystem crash, which, though not inevitable, is highly probable. Her message began this way. In the middle of the 20th century, we saw our planet from space for the first time, a new perspective. Historians may eventually find that this vision had a greater impact on thought than the Copernican revolution of the 16th century, which upset human self-image by revealing that the Earth was not the center of the universe. And it went on to say, from space we saw a small and fragile ball dominated not by human activity and edifice, but by a pattern of clouds, oceans, greenery, and soils. Humanity's inability to fit its doings into this pattern is changing planetary systems fundamentally. This new reality, from which there's no escape, must be recognized and managed. This is where we have now the question of responsibility and accountability to ourselves and future generations. Can we manage the consequences of the actions that are taking place at this time? I submit that we can and we must. And I'd like to suggest to you 6 management challenges. The first is the management of human reproduction. I'm not sure that people will accept this fact that from a reproduction point of view, we have been a remarkably successful species. Somehow, we have reproduced ourselves in ways that nature perhaps could not have managed, not have imagined. And if present trends are to be believed, we are likely to move from 6 billion people to 11 billion before we move through the demographic transition. Can the planet take it? We were amused that this morning when we were talking about people in the audience who are more than 100. Well, the fastest growing demographic, at least in the United States, are people living to be more than 100, which is rather interesting. We're living 2 generations in one. And there is a question now, can the planet indeed take it? The challenge now is how to manage our reproductive resources as a matter of personal responsibility and choice, how to bring our numbers more in line with the planet's carrying capacity. This is indeed new. And certainly, whether we talk about pro-choice or pro-life, this is not a matter of sloganeering. It's a matter of personal responsibility, and we better get on with seeing how we might be able to do it. The second is managing the Earth's biological production systems. That is our soils, our forests, our biodiversity, and our energy. How do we do this? And looking over the landscape, I think one is appalled at the extent to which we're treating natural capital with reckless disregard. We're deforesting the planet, and people are telling us that the forests are being felled at approximately 110,000 square kilometers a year, or 20 hectares a minute. And if this continues, the world's forest cover is likely to be reduced from its 6% to much less. I have been an environmentalist for a number of years, and I have not yet seen any conclusive study that would suggest to me how much green space does the planet need to perform its ecological function. How much green space do we need? And yet we know that we're cutting the planet's forest down at an alarming rate. One thing is clear in this destruction is that we're undermining the planet's gene pool and its biodiversity. And this is likely to have very, very significant impacts. First of all, we don't know what we're losing because we don't know what we have. Nowhere have we ever calculated what the species level on the planet is. We're told that we have between 5 and 30 million species. When you have that kind of range, you know that we're not entirely confident as to exactly what the numbers are. But we're losing species at approximately 1 million a year. The scientist E.O. Wilson at Harvard suggests that this could be an ecological catastrophe worse than any wars that we have ever witnessed. But there's more to genetic diversity than the loss of a few exotic species. Suddenly, we're beginning to see the connection between genetic diversity and food security. We have destroyed most of the wild strains on which our food depends. Some 4/5 of the world's food now comes from approximately 20 plant species, which is now at risk. And furthermore, such species as wild and domestic varieties of plants such as rice, wheat, millet, beans, yam, tomatoes, potatoes, and so forth, are reaching the point where they may be extinct. The wild strains may be pushing themselves to extinction. Now, I'm sure that the genetic engineer will tell you, well, we can create this in a lab. I'm not entirely sure genetic engineering is the answer. But there's another reason why we should be concerned about species and species loss, and that's human health. Nature works in pairs. Every predator has a prey. Human intervention is destroying this balance. And in many instances, you have predators without prey or vice versa. Whenever we cut the forest down and destroy habitats, we're releasing organisms into the human environment, which has very dire consequences. A colleague of mine from University of South Florida, Mark Jerome Walters, has documented the linkage between loss of biodiversity and human health in such areas as SARS, West Nile virus, Ebola, and HIV/AIDS. He's showing that when these species disappear, you create a gap in the life chain, and we humans serve as hosts. So the pandemics are not a matter of science fiction. It may very well be the result of the loss of diversity, and we humans become hosts in the process. How do we manage this? I mean, we're very concerned now about the latest of the pandemics, the issue of bird flu, and what could happen if this hits the world and hits it the way some of the other pandemics have in the past, such as AIDS. And so we need to look very clearly and closely and soberly at what we're doing to the planet's species. And I think if there's a connection between the loss of diversity and health, it becomes personalized, and people might pay attention. This occurred, as you may recall, in the ozone depletion argument. For many years, the scientists were talking about the science of ozone degradation, but it was only when we linked it to skin cancer, cataracts, and blindness that the world took notice that there is indeed a link between atmospheric chemistry and human health. One can only hope that we may make the same kind of linkage between the loss of biodiversity and health. One could go on in terms of what's happening to the production systems as we talk about the loss of productive soils, that at this stage, only 11% of the world's soil system is good for agriculture. And we're losing that topsoil at the rate of about 26 billion tons a year. And there's no way in which you can replace that, since, as scientists tells us, it takes between 100 and 400 years to build a few millimeters of topsoil, and maybe 3,000 to 12,000 years to create the kind of condition that exists now for agriculture. So unless we plan more carefully, our agricultural future could be very much in doubt. A question that, again, should be more forcefully presented to the global public. The fourth of our management challenges is the technological production systems. Ladies and gentlemen, we're a remarkably productive species, but we're equally remarkably waste-generating species. And one can look at the pattern from household waste, chemical waste, solid waste, genetic waste, or what we call genetic junk, and space debris. In almost every natural domain, the waste footprint is very apparent. And one can ask the question, what indeed will happen with genetic waste, the result of genetic experiments gone awry? Do we simply flush it down the drain? And what happens when this gets out into other parts of the planet's ecosystem? Most of us are very concerned now about the waste stream and its discharge into the oceans. Antibiotics, birth control ingredients are now showing up in marine spaces. What will this do to marine life forms? We have no idea on this. Space debris is also another real problem. As the space explorers are telling you, that whenever they fly, they worry about what they call flying the gauntlet out. There's so much space junk and debris there that one day we may miscalculate our orbits and hit something that might create a catastrophe. And so the question of waste management is a very important and urgent one for which we are not taking sufficient notice. The good news is that waste is an unnatural act. There's no such thing in nature as waste. Nature produces or utilizes everything that it produces. And that may be the model that humanity might emulate. There is indeed some responses that are very encouraging as recycling seems to be taking hold. And we're now talking about waste-free society. I know some countries are approaching us by suggesting, what should we do to bring about a zero-waste society? And this is very much within the human capacity for management. But also we know that the waste problem could create very serious political problem. The world resource system is finite. There isn't enough resources to go around at the level of consumption. And the competition for scarce resources is likely to generate conflict. We're seeing this on many fronts. The attempt to control the oil resource of the planet is very clearly manifest. But the attempt to control the water resource of the planet is also very manifest. If you talk to the water bottlers of the planet, you know that they are buying up water resource systems around the world. And many times we talk about privatization of water as one solution to the water problem. I'd ask you to stay tuned on this issue of the water resources of the planet and how we can manage it. The irony is that this world is not short of water. Scientists will tell you that we have 4 times as much water as we are consuming today. The problem is, potable water is never in the right time, in the right places, and in the right quantities or qualities. The water budget is not distributed by the UN with due regard for equitable geographic distribution. The water budget is distributed by nature, and nature knows best. We have to make the best use of what is available and how we manage it. An urgent management challenge. And the serious problem is that although we talk about impending problem, I'm not sure that the world has moved aggressively enough to look at the issue of water security as a very major issue. Last week at a film festival in Orlando, I saw one of the most gripping films on the world water crisis, or impending world water crisis, and the fact that people spend so much time, especially women, trying to secure enough water to last them a day and tomorrow they repeat it. And one person was saying that the right to water is a right to life. A slogan, but I think it has a lot of meaning there. The right to water is a right to life. Without it, I'm not sure that we can function. We can function without petroleum fuels. It requires radical adjustments and maybe rediscovering of human locomotion, but I'm not sure there's any substitute for water. It's a must-have. And I believe the world needs to think more seriously, more compassionately, more equitably, and more justly about how we manage the world's water budget. And this is, to me, one of the more urgent problems that we need to address. And finally, the question is, how do we manage the global commons? And by commons, I mean ocean space, the atmospheric commons, and migratory species, etc. Ladies and gentlemen, we know that the atmosphere faces a triple threat of acid rain, ozone depletion, and global warming. We are very lucky that we have addressed two of these problems with some success. The acid rain problem, which emitted sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide as part of the atmospheric deposits, was creating very, very serious problem for aquatic life and for physical structures. I know there are architects in the House, and I know they know this, that acid water was a very serious challenge to the world monument systems. Because of acid rain, the great cathedral in Cologne, Germany, it was flaking. You could simply scrub the flakes off because of acid rains. The marbles in Rome and Greece were also showing acid stress because of acid rains. The Greeks were thinking very seriously of putting some of their monuments under glass. Architects know this. Fortunately, we were able to get a handle on the acid rain problem, although in Asia it may be resurfacing. The ozone depletion problem was an act of preventive diplomacy, and we're able to get a fairly decent handle on that. But the global warming and climate change remains a very, very urgent and serious problem. For years, scientists have been telling us that if present trends continue in fossil fuels use and the buildup of greenhouse gases, we're likely to change global temperature between 1 and 4 degrees centigrade sometimes in the next century. Now, this does not seem like much. It's a small change. But it's not the volume of the change, but the rate of the change. Some 4 to 40 times faster than anything known in nature. And the consequences are likely to be devastating. Heat is energy. And if the planet warms up, the atmosphere will become more energy retentive. And we can expect some very, very serious consequences, such as the killer storms, the problem of hurricanes and cyclones, and other atmospheric disturbances. For the airlines, they're concerned about wind shear, aridization, and dust. These are problems that are only now beginning to surface. Unfortunately, despite what the political candidates are saying about human-induced results, we can say with confidence at the United Nations that we created a mechanism to study this. And although there had been a great deal of uncertainty, we now can say with confidence that human intervention is indeed affecting the world's climate system. And this is not a propaganda stunt. This is a matter of scientific reality. And so consequently, we need to find ways of managing this. We now have a climate convention, as I think most of us know. We have the Kyoto Protocol, which is up for review. And we now have a greater public awareness and sensitivity to what's happening in the world's climate system. Thanks in large measure to the Al Gore film, An Inconvenient Truth. Suddenly, climate is in the public domain. Suddenly, everyone is talking about my carbon footprint and what do I need to do to reduce carbon emission at the personal level. Here, another example of personal responsibility. The travel industry is likely to be hardest hit. Recently, I saw a very interesting debate in Canada that long-distance travel might be sinful, might be morally reprehensible because of the large carbon footprint that one leaves when you fly from Ottawa to Australia 3 or 4 times a year. I suppose I am a great sinner because I do those routes very, very frequently. But a little eco-hypocrisy never hurts anyone. The fact is that we are now beginning to look at how we use the resource of the planet and what kind of carbon footprints do we leave. Because the consequences are likely to be very dire. We're talking now not only about sea level rise, as some countries like Vanuatu and Tuvalu and Marshall Islands are beginning to realize now as realities. They're evacuating their people. Some are negotiating with Australia to take the population. The first ecologically displaced populations may certainly surface in Asia Pacific. Marshall Islands is only 18 feet above sea level, and a decent storm surge can inundate that country without any problems. Changing patterns in rainfall is also something that we begin to monitor very closely. Long dry spells and short bursts of very, very heavy rains, and I think most of us who live in the US will have discovered that. In some instances, these rains create very, very serious problems and might give us the first ecological refugees. Haiti is a very good case in point. It's flood prone. Haiti experienced 3 very devastating hurricanes last summer, Gustav, Hannah, and Ike. It's rather interesting that we talk about these problems, but we never talk about how to manage our vulnerability. How does the planet develop a system and a strategy for managing planetary vulnerability as a result of global warming and climate change? The Haitians will have something to say about this. There's a problem also of vegetation migration. Plants usually are climate specific. You change one part of the equation and other things are going to happen. Pest infestation. As the temperatures change, we're likely to find introduced in our environments pests that we thought we had already eliminated. 2 cases of malaria was recently showed up in Italy, and the British are very concerned about some tropical diseases showing up there. How do you manage the health of our people? This goes even to the Arctic. Recently, I was at a conference when an Inuit elder got up and said, "I saw a bee today," and he sat down. And these are people who I think are repositories of ancient wisdom. They've lived in that region for some 20,000 years, and they've managed to survive. They are masters of sustainability, and they have managed to live with a curious harmony with nature, but now they're hurting, and they're hurting badly. From the problems of PCBs in the breast milk of women to the melting of the permafrost, and their buildings are sinking, they face very, very serious problems there. And if indeed the Arctic ice was to melt, as scientists tell us it will, that in the next 40 years, the Arctic will possibly be ice-free, and a new transit route will have been opened that will significantly reduce the distance from the Americas to Asia Pacific. This is creating very serious problems. It could also create some very serious resource problems. The Russians have already planted its flag on the Arctic oceans, claiming that the Arctic is an extension of Russian territory, and the Arctic resources belong to the Russians. The Americans have some news for the Russians, but that's another matter. The fact is the scramble for Arctic resources are likely to expand. And so climate change is likely to create some immediate political problems that will have to be carefully managed. And finally, there's a problem of ocean degradation, a subject on which I have been devoting a good deal of time recently. Known variously as the source of all life, the mother of all ecosystems, the largest and most important terrestrial domain, covering 2/3 of the Earth's surface, it regulates the world's climate systems, stabilizes the hydrological cycle, it's a major food source for an expanding world populations, it's the world's most important trade route. I'm not sure how many people know that 90% of global trade is transported by sea. The seas are extremely important, and we're building ever larger container ships. 2 years ago, the Norwegians produced something called the Emma Maersk. It's a container ship that can take 15,000 containers on a single run. It has 11 cranes, and is larger than the largest US aircraft carrier. This for seaborne trade, and it's expanding. Moreover, the oceans hold secrets that could cure many diseases and enhance the quality of life and human well-being on the planet. It's often called the switch of life, as well as the source of life. Yet more is known about the far side of the moon than is known about the oceans. Our ignorance of the oceans, its reckless regard of its resources, not to mention the habitat loss, cannot help us but wonder whether we may not be well advanced on the road to self-destruction because of the problems of ocean degradation. Last year I was in China at a conference, and a 9-year-old girl was given the floor, and she told the audience of ministers and senior scientists, "Ladies and gentlemen, when I was little," now I can't understand why a 9-year-old talk about being little, but she said, "When I was little, I used to go to the sea with my parents, and it was full of fish. It was very pleasant. Now I see many dead fish with their sad, glaring eyes, asking, 'What have you done to my world?'" This might be a small anecdotal piece of information, but in a short lifetime, things seem to be speeding up. She saw a difference at 9 years old. And I think this is what we need to address as urgently as possible. The oceans remains the world blind spot. And there are several reasons for this. First of all, there is the overfishing. Recently it was reported that in the 50 years since the introduction of industrial fishing, 90% of the world commercial stocks have been depleted. And if you're a Canadian living in the maritime states, you can understand this. The cod stocks had collapsed. And after 10 years of a moratorium, it has not recovered. And this is a very real problem. The dead zones are increasing, and maritime waste is also a very serious problem. I am not sure how many people appreciate the fact that in the Pacific Ocean, we have what is called the Pacific Jar, where 10 million tons of trash is now floating on the oceans. Ladies and gentlemen, this is just a brief summary of some of the hazards and challenges that we face. But there's no reason to be defeated in advance. I think it was Einstein who said, it's a smart man who knows how to solve problems, but a wise one who knows to avoid them. My hope is that this conference might help us to take the next step from applied brilliance to applied wisdom. Trend is not destiny, and the logical future based on the extrapolation of existing trends is not inevitable, nor is doomsday. Thank you very much.